What's up guys, Sean the Bro here, and today we're going to be going over more match flow. Specifically, we're going to focus on character entrances and being able to skip them today though. So we're going to better our match flow system by using our match states to really solidify a lot of our logic here, not make it so dependent on the animation blueprint and certain animations and all these additional bools, but we're also going to be able to skip these animations. So you can see at the start here, we have these character entrances that play before the fight begins. Afterward, of course, we can play and start fighting each other. Alright, if we relaunch this, and we'll go into it again, I can pick a different stage, doesn't matter, there's different stage intros. But once the stage intros are done, we go to the character entrance phase. Once we're in those, each character, or if we have teams in the future, each team will have at least one entrance. And so I can now press a button to skip the character intro, the character entrance. We're going to show two methods of doing this as well. So let's relaunch one more time even. I'm going to show you the default game mode BP, so you can watch the match state here, okay? You can make sure everything's working as intended. So if we relaunch this one, go back here, you can see that it's going to go to the stage intro, and then it's going to go to the character entrances 1 and 2. But if I press the button to skip, I can skip to the second one, skip to the beginning of the match. I can also go into the game mode. I've included an additional boolean called should skip all character entrances, which you probably can guess what's going to happen here, but basically if I am to load up the game a fourth time, load into a stage, we can't skip stage intros yet, although after this episode you'll probably know how we can do that in the future. And then if I press the skip button, then both the character entrances get skipped and we go immediately to the fight. So we have two options here where we can manually skip each intro, or we can skip all of them at one time. This will probably be a global setting defined in your game, but it could also change by the version of the game that you're on. So for example, if I'm in a online lobby, I may only want to be able to skip my intro. The other player has control over their intro. However, if I'm fighting just a standard AI or bot, then I might want to be able to skip both if I press the skip button. So they both could be functional within the same game. In today's episode, we'll be covering all that logic, as well as, again, a few additional match state and match flow updates. But before we get started, if you'd like to get caught up in the series, we're on episode 124 or 125 of the Fighting Game Tutorial series. We've come a very long way. We have a lot to do, but we're doing great work and I'm excited about it. So if you'd like to get caught up, I'll link this playlist right here in the top right corner that includes every fighting game tutorial episode to date. I will also go ahead and link this episode right here, which is the previous match flow episode, if you'd like to get caught up on all these additional updates we've been doing. Alright, so now we can get started. Let's go into the code today. Specifically, we need to go into the fighter template game mode and the base player controller. We can go into the fighter template game mode first and just add this boolean because it's very simple. So if you go to your fighter template game mode.h, I've added this boolean that I was telling you about, where we determine if we should skip all of the character entrances individually or together. You know, basically at one input. Okay, so you can add a boolean for this, so you can enable it, disable it when you'd like, or if you'd like it to be a global setting that applies across the board, then you can make this your mandatory logic for the game mode. I would give it a default value in the constructor. I just set it to false by default because I like skipping them manually, and because it'll be good for testing things like team intros when we have to pick certain characters and have specific sets of dialogue between them. These sort of things come in handy to be able to skip them and speed up the process, that's for sure. Now, that's super simple. You don't have to do anything else in the game mode, but we do have quite a bit to do in the base player controller. So specifically, if we scroll down to our perform start input logic function. So this function that we have, this perform start input logic, this is where we press the start button and it's going to do different types of action depending on the match state that we're in. So quick recap, we have this input open pause menu, which is bound to the P key on the keyboard or the start button on a controller. And once it's pressed, it calls this logic, this perform start input logic. So when we go down to this function, we had it set up to where we were checking to see if the game mode was valid, and if it was, we were checking the match state against the stage intro, character entrances. Otherwise, we were just going to perform the pause game logic. Now, the stage intros I'm not dealing with today. That'll be a separate episode, so I haven't done anything additional in the logic. The else if is where our logic is going to be today. And then the else for the pause I also haven't updated yet. That will be in an additional episode. So to date, what we were doing is we had these blueprint implementable events that we could call and trigger logic within these functions. So basically the game mode could call skip character intros if we pressed start or the P key during one of the character entrances. Well, I don't actually need this anymore. I specifically don't, because I don't need any blueprint logic to occur when I'm pressing this input. I can do everything I need in the code. You could feel free to leave this skip character intros function in here if you want. For now, I have the event in here. It just doesn't do anything, so it doesn't really hurt anything. I'd want to clear it out if I never added logic to it. But if you have logic in the game mode blueprint that you'd like to do when you are skipping character entrances, such as play a special sound effect or perform, mess around with the cameras to get it a little bit more fluid, you can feel free to leave this in here. In fact, I probably will, because I have some ideas that we could do when skipping, such as creating widget effects, for a fade and things to make it look better when we're skipping. But I'm not actually going to be using that today. All of our logic to skip the character entrances is just this right here. It's very simple. It's going to actually skip the cutscenes using only the match state. We're going to set up these animations to work off the match state alone, and it's going to make our game flow seriously so much better, because we're not going to have a reliance to the animation blueprint and a lot of these other variables. Okay, so let's go over this logic. It's actually very simple. We're going to grab our game mode reference that we already have from this if statement above. And then we're going to check our new Boolean. Should we skip all character entrances? If we should, and we are already in the character 1 entrance or character 2 entrance, then we're going to simply set the match state to match begin. This means we're skipping. It doesn't matter if we're character 1 or character 2 entrance. We're just saying, nope, we're past these and we're in our match begin state. Now, if we go to our Flutter template game mode, remember our match state, we have all these different types. Match begin is when the text is appearing on the screen like ready, fight. So we're basically skipping the entrances and just automatically setting it to the next state. Else, if we don't have this should skip all character entrances checked, then that means we have to skip each character entrance individually. To do that, we have to determine which one we're on, and we set it to the next state according to that. So if we are on the first character entrance, if the match state is equal to character 1 entrance, then all we do is we actually set the match state to be character 2 entrance. Otherwise, if we are in the character 2 entrance already, then we should just straight up send it to match begin, because we want to do the same logic that we were doing as if we skipped the last entry. We want to start the match. So it's literally that simple. We can just skip these based off of the match state. We can set the match state to the appropriate value. Then in the animation blueprints, we can handle the logic to say, yep, we're in this state and this is what we want to be doing. So once you have this down, you're good to go with the code. Let's go into the engine. And there's a few things we need to do. The main things are going to be in the default game mode BP and the mutant anim BP, or your character's animation blueprint. We can go to the default game mode BP. You can check your box in the class defaults if you'd like, or leave it unchecked for now. Doesn't matter. One note I am going to change is I'm going to arbitrarily manually set going to the character entrance once we set up our other variables on our character. So we have this level streamed in event that gets called after the stage intro, basically saying everything's streamed in, we're ready to spawn our characters and possess them and, use the proper camera, all this good stuff that we're doing here. Okay, so once we do that, once we have all of our logic here, I've decided we should just set the character 1 entrance to be the match state. We were waiting to set the match state in the animation blueprint when the animation actually triggered for the character. So for example, when the first character would go into the entrance animation. We were setting the match state to be the character 1 entrance. Now that worked and that was fine, but it's kind of a silly way to do it because we already should be in the entrance state, and that should dictate the animations that the characters go into. So in my level streamed in at the end, or you could do it earlier, we know at this point we're ready to go to the character entrance. So we might as well just set the match state in here and then dictate the animation blueprint states off of that. All right. So with that said, let's go ahead and add this here. To add this, by the way, it's very simple. You can either call, we're in our default game mode BP. So we can either set match state like I've done here, okay? Manually set it to character 1 entrance, or you can technically do this like I was showing you in the previous episode. We set up a function in our base function library called set match state that we can call and then, you know, set it here. Either way is perfectly fine. In my opinion, it doesn't really make a difference. It is easier to just set the variable since we're already in the game mode. It's probably a little bit better for performance. However, separating these nodes could make it a little bit harder to debug later on if you have bugs with it, because you can't just put a breakpoint in this set match state and this will come up. So it's up to you how you want to do it. Feel free to change and use your base function library version to do that, or just set it like I've done here. If the need arises, we'll adjust it later, but I don't see any issues with that for now. That's the only thing we have to do in our default game mode BP, but just make sure you do that, because we want, as soon as we actually stream in the level and we're ready for the character entrances, we want to set that to be the state that the game mode is in. That way we can move our characters along to it. Now before we do too much in our animation blueprint here, let's talk about some of the logic that we have in our event graph. Specifically, let's look at the start character entrances event that we had. So what we were doing is we had this is like a default state that holds the entry until the characters are ready. And then we have the entrance sequence. So this is our actual entrance animation. Okay. Now, once we actually went from this default, basically temporary state to the actual entrance, and we were going to begin the entrance logic, I had made the start character entrances anim notify event, and I'd only done that so that I could go into this guy here, you know, capture this event, and then determine if the character is player 1 or not, and then set the appropriate match state. Again, that works fine, but it's kind of a little silly because we can dictate the animations based off the match flow, as opposed to the other way around. So what I'm actually doing is I'm going to remove this, but you can keep it for now until you have the logic working. That way, if something goes wrong, you can always reattach this. We'll delete this after we get the other stuff working. But just notice that I've unattached it. We're not going to be using it. So what I am going to do is I'm going to get rid of this event from the entrance to the entrance sequence. I don't have one anymore. Okay. And so let's look at it this way. Now what should really happen is we should be stuck in this state until we are ready to begin our entrance. We should begin our entrance when there are actually a few conditions here. Okay, so before, what we were doing is we had this is ready for entrance boolean, and this would be checked to see if we could go into the entrance. This was really set individually for each player. Basically, it was set manually for player 1 in the game mode, actually, right here. And then once that happened, we would go into this animation. It would go through call an event. Once the entrance was done, it would check to see if both characters had done their entrance, and if they haven't, it would set character 2 ready for their entrance. This worked, and actually it's not too bad of a method. It's a little confusing, but it does allow the animations to finish and will always play in the same order, so honestly, it's not too bad. But we can make it way easier and way cleaner now, so why don't we do so? Okay, so what we're going to do is basically get rid of this is ready for entrance boolean altogether. Feel free to continue to use it if you would like, but I'm not going to. So I'm getting rid of it in this transition rule. I'm also going to get rid of it in the default game mode BP, where we're arbitrarily setting this value. Okay, so I no longer manually set that variable in the default game mode BP. Okay, because we're not going to be using that variable anymore. Now, what that means is if we go into our event graph, you also see that we have all this logic here where we're checking the is ready for entrance and the other characters is ready for entrance, you can see that that's not plugged in, and the false is plugged in, but it can never be reached because there's nothing connecting to this branch, which means none of this logic is going to be needed anymore. Instead, we're going to do something else, which is way better. Okay, so with that, we have the mute and finished entrance disconnected and the start character entrances disconnected. We'll clean this up later in the event graph, but let me explain to you why we're getting rid of them, what we can do instead. Okay, so let's look at entrance to entrance sequence. This is the one we're in, remember. Instead of being ready for entrance, we have a few different things we can do now. So we want the characters to play their entrance sequences because they are ready to, because we are ready by the match state for them to. Not because just, oh, first character played theirs, so it's time to play mine. Okay, so the way we can do this, actually, so we'll look at this logic first, and I'll explain to you how I set some of this up. So first things first is we grab our match state and we check if it's match begin, or we check if we're player 1 and we're on the character 1 entrance, or we're not player 1, meaning we're player 2, and we're character 2 entrance. Any of these conditions together, so if any of those three evaluate to true, we want to go to the idle. This is because if it's match begin and we're not in any of these character entrances, that most likely means that we skip this state, meaning that the player had pressed an input to skip the entrances, in which case we do want to go to the entrance sequence, and it's going to automatically go to idle, or we'll explain that in a little bit. But basically just know it's going to skip from entrance to idle if we go to skip the sequence. So that's the first condition. So off our character reference, we have this is player 1 boolean, and what that does, if we look in our fighter template character, in our setup player input component, when this function gets called, we actually just check the game mode to see what, if we match like an actual player on the game mode. So if we match the player 1 variable, or if we don't, and we set these variables to true and false respectively. So basically we know if it's the first character that was spawned or the second character that was spawned. That's what this is really checking. And now if we are the right character for the right match state, we want to be able to go into the entrance animation. What I mean by that, if we're player 1, then character 1 entrance should be played when we're in the match state character 1 entrance. But character 2 should not be playing their entrance animation before we're looking at them with the camera, before we're in the character 2 entrance match state. So what we do here is we check our boolean is player 1, and we check to see that the match state is character 1 entrance. If this is the case, we are ready to play the animation on this character. Thus, we are ready to go into the entrance sequence. Alternatively, if is player 1 is not true, meaning it's false, so we're player 2, or the second character that was spawned, and we're on the character 2 match state, character 2 entrance match state, then we're ready to play the entrance animation for this character. If any of those evaluate to true, then we can go into the next state. So it might be a little bit confusing, but this really covers all our bases, and it makes it not dependent on the animation blueprint, but dependent on the match state, which is so much better because we have all these variables in the game mode for the match state that can be reliant on each other, that should be reliant on where we are in the game, not what a specific character is doing. Okay, it's alright if it still doesn't make sense because it is a big change. But just know, if you're trying to fill this out, you're probably like, how does he get this game mode reference? Because he doesn't have it. You could technically use the game mode reference from the character. But the problem with that is it might not be valid at the time of doing this. When a character is spawned, it has usually at least one frame before its begin play is called. Like, basically on its tick. And because of that, it could give you an invalid game mode for the first frame. And this animation blueprint would try and get this reference and it would throw errors. So really what we should do is just go into the event graph, go to the blueprint update animation function or event, make a new variable. I called mine game mode reference and I made it of type, and I made it my blueprint game mode right here. So it's an object reference of my default game mode BP, which is this guy. And we have a bunch of casts to the game mode in our animation blueprint, so this is nothing new. But we want a reference in here, that way we can actually use it in our state machine in this transition rule. So you can feel free to go ahead and update that, have this variable in here. We're going to set it in the blueprint update animation. Now it should be valid on the first tick because the game mode is what spawns the characters. So if we have a character here, we do have a game mode, but where you set it is somewhat up to you. You could set it in the begin play. You could set it at the end of your blueprint update animation. I like setting it right here where we were setting our character reference because, again, this is going to happen on the first tick. Both of these are going to be invalid on the first tick. We might as well set them on the first tick. That way we have no chance of them being invalid when we go into the animation blueprint state machine. So in our blueprint update animation, if you've been following the series, you'll have this where we check to see if the character reference is already valid. If it's not already valid, what we do is we cast the pawn owner, so the owner of this animation blueprint essentially, to the mutant BP, or the type of blueprint that owns this animation blueprint. Then we set it to be our character reference so we can use it in things like our state machine and other places throughout this event graph. Immediately after that, what I do is I now have this game mode reference, which I get it. I right click, I convert to validated get. Only if it's invalid, we want to then go ahead and set our game mode reference. So what I like to do is if it's not valid, we're going to cast to our default game mode BP or whatever the type is of your game mode reference variable here. We're going to get the game mode. Just like that. You can see I'm doing it above. And then we're going to use this to set the game mode reference. Okay. And then after that, I actually drag it back in to this top node here because once the character reference and the game mode reference are valid, if they are valid at this point, the try get pawn owner definitely would be valid. So that means everything here can also be assigned properly for the first time, for the first frame. So you can go ahead and just add these 4 nodes here. This will set a game mode reference, and now you can use a game mode reference anywhere in this animation blueprint without casting to it, and you can use it in things like our state machines. So now we can use our game mode reference to get the match state. You could also have written a getter in your base function library or something similar and just called that function and returned it here into your variable. All right. Speaking of, for your base player controller, where we set up our match state logic, you could actually have used a setter or a mutator, if you're familiar with those. So have a function in the game mode called set match state and pass in the appropriate value. That would probably be a little bit cleaner, but otherwise, everything's good to go. Okay. And now with this guy. So now you have your game mode reference and you can reach your match state. And you can now do everything that you see here. All I do is an equal enum, and then select the actual value that I'm looking for. These are Boolean and nodes, so if you drag off of a Boolean, you can type and you want and Boolean. This is a Boolean not node. Right here. And then we have the Boolean or node. Right here. Now, when you have the OR Boolean, you're only going to have 2 by default. You see I have 3 things plugged into it. You can click the plus to add a pin and have as many conditions as you want. So this is entrance to entrance sequence. So basically, this is when the character spawns. When can they enter the entrance sequence, or when can they enter their entrance animation? In the entrance sequence, we have the ability, we have this animation here, and we have an anim notify on it called mutant finished entrance. This is previously where we were checking the is ready for entrance Boolean and doing a bunch of extra logic. If you go into your event graph and we go up to this right here, we have this mutant finished entrance anim notify. We were checking, the is ready for entrance and setting it for the other player. Well, I don't want to be using this one on the animation anymore. I'm actually just going to update it to when we're going to idle from the entrance. So I've made another one. That way I didn't have to delete it and I could show you what I mean. So entrance sequence to idle is an animation that was previously automatic rule based. We're going to be adding a rule to it today. Okay, so I've unchecked the automatic rule based Boolean box here. And I've now added mutant finished entrance 2. But really, we shouldn't call it mutant finished entrance 2. What I want to do is I want to go to my entrance animation, delete the anim notify because I'm not going to need it anymore. And instead, what I would like to do is in the event graph, instead of having this mutant entrance with this is ready for entrance logic, I'm going to get rid of all of that, except for the true. Okay, don't get rid of the where we have the branch. It's going to go into logic to change back to the default camera and do things like spawn the HUD and set the match state. Don't get rid of that stuff. Only get rid of the logic up to the branch and the false. We will no longer need any of that. So you can see everything here, everything that's highlighted there, I'm going to just get rid of. In which case we can make this cleaner. So let me do so. I'll explain this in a little bit, so don't worry. We're not there yet. I just want to show you what I'm doing. I'm getting rid of that anim notify instead I'm using a new anim notify. Okay. Alright. Alright, so now I have my mutant finished entrance 2, which I'm going to rename to mutant finished entrance 1. That has literally overridden the old mutant finished entrance that we had. I will have to grab it again. There we go. So this event that you had, mutant finished entrance, it's still here, but we've moved it. It's not on the animation. It's not tied to the specific animation anymore. It's actually tied to the transition between the entrance to idle. So when the character's finishing their entrance and going to the idle animation, I have a start transition event called mutant finished entrance. That is where we will be doing that logic from now on. This is important as it will allow us to finish the entire entrance animation regardless of blend time and still call this event. It also allows us to call this event even when we skip the entrances. So before, if it was on the animation and we skipped the entrance, it would skip that part of the animation, in which you wouldn't always hit that anim notify. We definitely don't want that. Here we still want this logic to occur. We just want to skip the animation and go immediately to idle. So it's very important that we update that. So with that done, let's go to our event graph. I'm now going to officially get rid of start character entrances because we have enough logic in here. We don't need that one anymore. And now let's look at mutant finished entrance. Let's fill this out before we go any farther. So now what we have to do is determine how we want to get from the entrance animation to the idle animation. So this is the entrance, this is the mutant roar, this is the idle, the default animation that they go to. Okay, so once they are going to idle, what do we need to do? That's the question we need to ask. So in this anim notify, I get my game mode and I cast it to my fighter template game mode. In fact, that's what we've been doing previously. Just realizing this now, but we actually don't need to do that. We can use our new game mode reference if we'd like. We can convert it to a validated get to clean it up. Just like that. Not required you do that, as you saw it was working before, but I just noticed it now that we still left that in, and we might as well use our new game mode reference. So, okay, let's move this over a bit. Now we have our game mode reference, and we're getting the match state from it. The match state is then checked against different variables to determine what we want to do with it. So, if the match state is on character 1 entrance when this fires, remember, mutant finished entrance here. This is when we're transitioning to the idle animation. So if we're transitioning to idle and the match state is character 1 entrance, that means that the first character has finished their entrance animation. Okay? If they finish their entrance animation, we want to update the match state now to be character 2 entrance. Because now the second character that spawned should be doing their entrance animation. We don't want to do any further logic here, because the other logic that I have is the stuff that we had in our event to do things like trigger the HUD, change the camera back to the default camera so it's not on the mutant. We don't want to do that after the first character entrance. We just want to immediately skip to the second character entrance. Now, this is going to get called once when the first character goes from the entrance to the idle, and again when the second character goes from the entrance to the idle. So now if we go through this logic again, second time this is called, we get our game mode reference, we get our match state. It's going to be false that it's on match state of character 1 entrance, but the match state is going to be character 2 entrance. So we can do a branch here, and if it is character 2 entrance, we can then set the state to match begin. Because if the character 2 entrance is finished, that means both character entrances have finished. That is the natural progression and flow of the match, and thus we can go to match begin at that point. I do have an additional OR here. Before we do anything else, you can see that we have this logic here, which I think makes a lot of sense. Then you can see I was actually checking character 2 entrance or match begin state. This is because in the code we've decided to set the match begin as the match state once the character 2 entrance has been skipped, or once both the entrances have been skipped. If that was the case and we set it to match begin, this AnimNotify would still get called because it was trying to leave the entrance sequence and go and transition to idle. However, neither of these states would be true. The match state is actually equal to match begin right now. So it would actually fail out and we wouldn't be able to go any farther. So what you can do is just add this additional OR, check if it's equal to match begin, and just drag it in the same logic the character 2 entrance was. Like, this branch can handle both of these fine. You don't need to do a false in another one. You could, but it's just really not necessary. Now, after this, the good news is this logic is all the same as it was. So this logic is stuff you will have in your mutant finished entrance AnimNotify. So this is where we assign the camera back to the default value. So it's not the specialized camera for the entrance, but rather the regular camera. We're technically making the HUD visible, setting both entrances finished, setting the match state to match begin isn't really required here anymore. In fact, it's not necessary at all. It doesn't do anything because we're already setting it earlier. So I'd say go ahead and take that out. And then we set can move to be true for the characters and trigger the on-screen messages. This could be cleaned up further using our match state now. And since you've seen this in action, you can feel free to go play with it if you'd like. But we'll probably hit it up again in the future. The important part is that we have this section in the front down so that we're setting the match state accordingly based on what animations have played, what state the match is literally in. Not just the value that we're setting, but what is it really doing? Okay. Now we need to go to the actual AnimNotify transition. So we need to go from the entrance sequence to idle and the transition rule between them. So I can click into here and you can see it's not automatic anymore, as I said. Now what we're doing to go from entrance sequence to idle is we're waiting until the match state is either in begin, so if we skip the animations, or the relevant time remaining on this animation is less than or equal to 0, basically saying that the animation itself has finished. This you know how to do because we've gotten this several times. This one might be a little bit weird. Get relevant anim time remaining. The way you do this is get relevant anim time remaining. And you have a few here. You have the regular one and fraction. The regular one is perfectly fine for here. But it's going to have this in parentheses, entrance sequence. This is the name of the animation. If you have multiple animations, for example, you could have multiple animations in a single state, and you could do logic to switch between them, quite like our hit reaction. Any animations that you have in this actual section here, where you're outputting an animation pose, can be gotten in this node with the get anim time remaining. Okay. So with that in mind, if either of these conditions are true, we want to go to idle. So basically, if we've skipped the character entrances, we should go to idle. Or if the animations are finished, we should go to idle. All right. And at that point, we're actually done. We have a proper match state flow here. So our flow is dependent on the animations for where it needs to be. Like, it needs to depend on the length of the animation. Because, for example, if we had different characters with different entrances and different lengths, we don't have a way to define that if we don't get some sort of information from the animation. However, now we have the ability to get that information from the animation and then drive the flow of the match. That is the purpose of match flow, and that is excellent, excellent news. Now, again, this can still be cleaned up more. I'm going to be doing this more in the future. But the one thing that we did cover today that we should clean up is that is ready for entrance boolean. We can go ahead and get rid of that. Is ready for entrance. It is in the fighter template character.h. You can search for it with Control F if you'd like. We're going to get rid of it just to clean up this a bit. We don't need it. So we'll make our lives a little bit easier to have that gone. Going to search the entire project. So see, I want to take out my default set for it. At that point, I don't use it anywhere else in the code. So I can go ahead and save this and relaunch. We'll make sure that we don't use it anywhere else in the blueprint, and then we'll be good to go. Okay, now we're back in the editor. I get no errors, so you can see that I shouldn't have any references to is ready for entrance. If you'd like to make sure, what I like to do is go into any random blueprint. You can compile and save to make sure you don't get any errors, and then search for is ready for entrance. Use the binoculars to find them in all blueprints. Wait for it to finish indexing, and there's no results found, so we're good to go, meaning that that variable has appropriately been removed and functioning. Everything is functioning as it should be. At this point, you can now skip your character entrances to your heart's content, and we've cleaned up our match flow to be smoother and working in a better fashion than before. So anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please subscribe. Helps myself out and the channel a ton. I would also love to give a huge shout out to our Patreon members and YouTube membership subscribers. Thank you guys for always supporting me and having my back. Really appreciate it, and I love helping out whenever I can. Thank you so much. Keep up the good work, everyone. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. Be happy to get you sorted. Like I said, guys, I'm Sean the Bro. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.